with it, I want to bring in someone who knows these military issues well. Paul Rieckhoff is a former U.S. Army infantry officer and a veterans advocate who founded the Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America. Good to have you on. Thanks so much for joining.
My pleasure, Jim.
I want to begin on those personal issues because how would a uniformed member of the military be treated in the face of similar allegations to what Hegseth, who did, of course, serve, but is now a civilian? Would they be relieved of duty for the infidelities, the drinking, et cetera, that Hegseth has been accused of?
I think that's actually the most important question here, Jim, because we're not just talking about whether he's qualified. We're talking about whether he should be disqualified. And the truth is, the average enlisted soldier, Marine, airman would be judged harshly if they committed adultery, which is actually a violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, if they were drinking on the job, if they were lying to their subordinates or their superiors. So this really cuts to the question of character, which is really why this is not a normal process. Nothing about this is normal. We don't normally have to worry about whether or not a nominee is going to pass an FBI background check or whether or not they're going to get drunk on the job. But this is kind of a setting of a tone, I think, not just for the Defense Department, but what could be to come from the entire Trump administration here. And we're kind of lowering our standards. We're not talking about China policy. We're not talking about recruiting. We're not talking about nukes. We're talking about what he did and whether or not he took his staff to a strip club, which I think is really a bad reflection on where we are as Americans. But we also saw the Democrats maybe scored some damaging shots, but they didn't deliver any knockouts. Nothing new came out. They didn't really get him, to screw up in a way that's going to damage his overall nomination. And now I think we've got a wait and see period where it could be a week, maybe 2 weeks before the actual vote. And I think some of those moderate senators, Collins, Murkowski, Ernst, and others, are kind of keeping their powder dry because this is 2025, and we don't know what's yet to come.
I had exactly the same reaction you had, given that the Pentagon quite clearly identifies China and Russia, the primary threats to U.S. national security, as well as Iran and North Korea. There's an active war on the European continent, in Ukraine, threats to Taiwan, ongoing war in the Middle East. And the leader, the civilian leader of the largest military in the world, was not pressed on his plan for responding to those threats. And by the way, not just by a failure by Republicans, but by Democrats to press effectively on those issues. How much of a failure is that of this confirmation hearing?
I think it's a total failure. I think it's a total failure by both parties. I think it's a national security risk. I think, our enemies around the world see a hearing like this and they're celebrating. And I also, think there's the deeper issue, which is the Pentagon is supposed to be the least political part of our entire government, right? It's supposed to have a leader with integrity and character who can bring people together in a united mission to fight our wars and kill our enemies. And here with Hegseth, the reality is you've got the most overtly political, arguably most politically extreme, and least qualified person in history. I mean, this is the former Secretary of War. Previous nominees have been things like the Director of the CIA, have been Chief of Staff of the Army, but they've never been so overtly political. So what you saw is kind of the manifestation of a culture warrior, and that's what Hegseth is. He's been built for this moment to bring the culture war on behalf of Trump to the Pentagon. And as for right now, it looks like he's won this battle, and we'll see if he wins the war.
Yeah, I mean, much more talk in this hearing about his allegations of a woke military than the threat from two superpowers, right, nuclear armed superpowers. Before we go, I want to get into the exchange between Senator Slotkin and Hegseth, because in the first Trump administration, we had members of Trump's administration, including a former defense secretary, Mark Esper, speak about being given unlawful orders. So Slotkin attempted to press Hegseth on that. I want to play that exchange and get your thoughts on how he answered.
Okay, are you saying that you would stand in the breach and push back if you were given an illegal order?
I start by saying I reject the premise that President Trump will be giving any illegal orders at all in any particular scenario.
Donald Trump asked for the active duty 82nd Airborne to be deployed during that same time. Secretary Esper has written that he convinced him against that decision. If Donald Trump asked you to use the 82nd Airborne in law enforcement roles in Washington, D.C., would you also convince him otherwise?
I'm not going to get ahead of conversations I would have with the president. However, there are laws and processes inside our Constitution that would be followed.
Was that a satisfying answer to that question?
It was to Donald Trump, probably. I mean, it's a non-answer that is damning. And I think the question I would have asked is, who is your primary loyalty to, Donald Trump or the American Constitution? Because that's what's at stake here. And this is really Trump 2.0. In Trump 1.0, you had General Mattis, who was widely respected, 40 years of service, a nonpartisan person who you could trust to be loyal to the Constitution first and stand in that breach when necessary. Now you've got Pete Hegseth, who most of all is a loyalist, and told you pretty clearly right there that he's going to do what the president asks him to do, potentially even if it's in violation of the Constitution. And that's what should, I hope, alarm and move the moderate Republicans who are somehow still on the fence here.
We'll know in a few days. Paul Rakoff, thanks so much for sharing your views.